Okay, so yes, if everyone could remember to rate the talk and give me feedback, not on this brilliant technical start where my button doesn't work anymore, but did anyone see the previous talk on the microservices stuff in Go? So my colleague who's sitting over there, Carl's got one of those cards. We went around Copenhagen on one of the e-bikes. Has anyone been on an e-bike yet? I really recommend, yeah, it's really cool, isn't it? I mean, it's like, it weighs a ton, but it's got an electric motor in it, and it's got a little screen with sat-nav on it. And we typed in and we docked our card, put our credit card numbers in, and it came up at the end of the ride, that's 50 Danish kroner. And I was like, what's that in pounds? Because who knows, you know, pounds crashing as the day goes by. And of course, Carl's got the little app, and he just pulls out his phone and he goes, oh, it's £5.84. So that was pretty impressive. So I'm going to go and hunt down one of those cards. So as I say, I'm a really keen cyclist, and I was really lucky as I worked for this company, which is a consultancy, that I got to cycle all over London, going to various clients, telling them how to do good software development. And that was really good. So I worked for 6 years just doing consultancy, dealing with lots of different companies, not just in London, in various places. But now I work as the head of technology, and I'm responsible for all of our internal systems. So, you know, that's basically what we use to run Thoughtworks as a consultancy. And when I started 3 years ago, Thoughtworks had TechOps had a little bit of a reputation of what's called the Cobblers children. So this is a psychological condition if you go to any of these kind of pop psychology websites. So it must be a real one because I've seen it on a pop psychology website. And it basically means that any kind of organization that sells something as a business, whether that's a consultancy or a marketing company, like the cobbler who makes shoes, they tend to rather neglect their own children, their internal things. So while we were going around telling companies how to write amazing, brilliant software, because that's what you pay us for, and how to do continuous delivery, and how to do microservices, and how to do all this wonderful stuff, inside, it was a bit of a different picture. We had what we called a Stovepipe Enterprise. So basically what was happening is we had a very, very tiny IT department run mainly on Lotus Notes. Anyone still have to suffer Lotus Notes? Oh, you poor people. And what would happen is the business, as people like to refer to it, would go out and make decisions, and they would go and buy stuff, whatever it was, and then they would say, here you go, TechOps, we've gone out and we've bought this solution, and now we want you to install and run it. And that's pretty much where we get engaged in the vendor lifecycle. So what we had was lots of solutions that solved a very specific problem with no real integration strategy, which was really interesting to me as I kind of came into TechOps, because that's what I'd been spending the last 6 years going out to clients to do. So there I am. It's like, this is interesting. I've been going around to clients for 6 years who've been really badly integrating software, and we've been going in as Thoughtworkers going, oh, you're terrible. It's really easy. You just need to do this, 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 this. But when we were left to write our own software, we did exactly the same as what we told the clients to do. We also had this great, what I call mic drop development, which made the situation a little bit worse. So I call it mic drop development because basically what would happen is we'd get a team together to solve a particular problem, maybe an integration problem, or to write a much needed app. And the team would come in, they would develop the app, and then they'd drop the mic. We're done. It's in production. Bye. And then the ops team would be left to look after that mic and, keep it running. So, not a great pattern to have. To make it worse, we're all over the world. I mean, this is our current count, 40 offices in 14 countries. It was probably a bit less 3 years ago, but this is what it is. 4,000 employees, about 150 of those in TechOps. So these mic drop development teams would spring up basically where we had a few people spare. So it might be in China because there's been a graduate program and we've just hired a load of graduates in China and they're sitting around not staffed at the moment. So we think, hey, we've got a good idea. Why don't you fix this problem and develop this system over here? And then the next week it might be in India, or it might be in the UK or Chicago. So there wasn't really a strategy there. It was just wherever we could find people. So again, that makes the situation worse. So we had this kind of thing where what we ended up with was a number of permanent teams with these disappearing and reappearing project teams. But we still needed its stuff to be supported. So the permanent teams ended up kind of structured around that. So we ended up with vendor teams because the vendors always stay around. So if we're using Salesforce, someone's got to look after Salesforce. So you have a little team of people, specialists in Salesforce. We ended up with an ops team because we've got a server farm and they've got to look after all the servers. And we ended up with a DBA team because, you know, most of the solutions run on Oracle, and if you're going to run Oracle, you need a DBA team, right? So add all of this together, and this was our architecture. Now, don't try and look at it. It will make you feel a bit ill. It made me feel a bit ill. But the important things to note is any of these colors is an important domain concept, such as an employee. And what we did was smeared it across our architecture as much as possible. To make it much better, we thought we'd do a lot of direct database access, you know, just to help get that data to travel around. So that's what we did. We thought we'd create like a nice monolithic database in the middle to help this, because we thought we could solve it that way, and we called that the middleware database. To send, you know, a chill through your spine, a middleware database. So we had monolithic middleware database and just stuff everywhere. No systems of record, a total mess. So this guy, Conways Law, I'm sure you've heard him talk about, people keep mentioning. But if you look at Conways Law and you look at that diagram, go back to that diagram, and it's no surprise we ended up with what we've got. So distributed all over the world, temporary teams that pop up. And, you know, actually our architecture looks like that. You know, it doesn't look like a well-thought-out, long-running architecture. But there's another law that I think is important, which is Fairmonts Principle of least time. So I like this because we always like physics analogies, don't we, in software development? Because if we can get it to a physics analogy, it must be true. Like Kelvin earlier used the one about, you know, like the Jupiter and the gravitational pull. So this is one of my favorites, which is basically, you know, the path between the shortest path principle, basically. Light takes the shortest path. So if you take that and this and Conway's Principle, basically you get any feature will find the development team that can implement it in the least time, so the shortest path. And that basically means you get a lot of monoliths. So what was happening is because we've got a team, a DBA team, that is permanent, and they're the ones that can respond quicker because they've got their hands on all the data, and we've got maybe a bit of a development team over here. Well, you know, what's going to happen if you want a new feature and you want to do something? Well, the DBA team are going to do the integration because they're the one with the permanent team. And if you've got a bit of a development team over here and you want to do something in the UI, well, that development team over there is going to do it. So you end up creating these monoliths just through these two principles when you put Conway and least time together. So we were in things weren't good. So our CIO, Dave Wally, said, what do we tell our clients to do? And so we went back to our kind of, you know, Thoughtworks, Martin Fowler, famous for Agile. That's what we do. So we went back to our core principles. Now, I've chosen XP here because I like XP. That's my core, right? That was my first Agile book. But we could choose any, Scrum, maybe. But there was this kind of principle of cross-functional teams that was really critical. And it was a really, I think, a very XP idea. So we went back to this and we said, you know, cross-functional teams are really important. That's what we should be doing. We shouldn't have these kind of project teams that are just springing up so many permanently. We want permanent, self-organized cross-functional teams. Now, there's two parts of cross-functional team that I really, really want to focus on, and that's I want to hold these themes throughout the rest of this talk. And the first one is that they're responsible for their own success. And, you know, yesterday we had Dan kind of talking about this when Agile first came out and the Agile Manifesto. And this was a really important change, you know, that a team is responsible end-to-end for their own success. And that meant that they could talk to the business, they could, you know, execute everything, that it wasn't like this kind of siloed, horizontal silos, it was vertical. And then came the next bit, which was all the expertise necessary to do so. So you would have testing, you would have infrastructure in there. And actually the first XP teams were probably quite dev-centric, and we didn't, maybe infrastructure came a bit later, but it was more about that business relationship. But over time, we've started putting more and more kind of things into dev teams, so they're becoming, you know, reaching this ideal of being all the expertise necessary to reach their own success. And then we had this guy who became he was the then head of technology when I joined, so he was kind of my boss. I put boss in inverted commas, not because, you know, he was like AWOL or anything, you know, but because we're meant to be non-hierarchical. So he was as close to a boss as I had. And at the time, 3 years ago, he was writing the Microservices Book. So he had quite a big influence on what we're doing, and we were trading lots of ideas about microservices and stuff. So we got this idea of cross-functional teams, and then, oh, microservices seem to fit, so let's try a bit of that. So what did we do? We did the inverse Conway maneuver. So we used these two concepts to do the inverse Conway maneuver. And we're a consultancy, so, you know, basically you can break a consultancy down into 3 capabilities. So going back to kind of capability modeling, which is rather than looking at the things you know, like the physical stuff, have a look at the things, the characteristics of your business. So if you look at any consultancy, they all tend to have 3 core capabilities, which is sales, sell stuff, sell people, essentially, staffing, staff people on the projects that they've sold, and the people themselves, which they're going to sell. Although we prefer to say people's time, because then it sounds a little bit less like you're in slavery. But so the other thing we did when we did this reverse Conway maneuver, which is really important, is we made these cross-functional. And we made them cross-functional across everything. So these teams do everything. It was support. You know, you build it, you run it, you support it. Vendor management, so they've got to look after their vendors. They've got to do their own stakeholder management, their change management. They've got to look after their infrastructure. They're responsible for their budgets. They're responsible for their travel. They're responsible for their staffing. These teams are responsible for everything from end to end. So they have product owners, they have business owners, and they are aligned with the business. So there is a head of sales, there is a head of staffing, etc. And those are the owner, and they work, those business people and the product owner work together in a team to define the direction for IT within their capability. And this was a massive change, and it was really good. And that had a big effect on how we started to approach problems. So before, we've got, you know, this is an example. This is true. This is what we actually had. We had the staffing monolith. The system was called Jigsaw. And going back to that Fairmonts Principle, what would happen is any feature that needed to be implemented would get put in the staffing system. It started out as a staffing system. Ironically, it started out as a staffing system that was a rewrite of a system before it, which had become a giant monolith that had become unwieldy, so it got separated out. And then we separated it out, rewrote it as a staffing system, and then just started that cycle again, because it was the only development team that could actually do anything. So it ended up with everything in it. It ended up with teams in it. It ended up with leave in it, which, you know, doesn't really have much to do with staffing. It ended up with rates in it. It was crazy. It was basically, we got, you know, someone would say, I really need to do this custom thing. Oh, it's really important. Oh, we'll put it in Jigsaw. And it didn't matter whether it was relevant to Jigsaw or not. It mattered that the business needed to execute this piece of functionality. So now we've changed this conversation. So now the conversation isn't, can Jigsaw implement it the fastest, or which team can implement it the fastest? It was, which business owner wants to own this functionality? Which capability team wants to own this functionality? And you change that. So now a new piece of functionality comes up. We're saying, staffing is saying, no, this doesn't belong in Jigsaw because this has got nothing to do with staffing. It's to do with people. So we're having a really, really interesting discussion about this last couple of weeks, which is about people data. You know, you've got certain characteristics about people data. A lot of people are getting that data, like name and stuff like that, and what office they work in. And they're getting that from the staffing system. But it's not really staffing information, it's people information. So now we're having this conversation, which is, actually, you know, this isn't in this bounded context. You know, this stuff needs to live over there in the people stuff. And if anyone's coming to staffing, we need to stop them. We need to get them back to the system of record. And the staffing team want rid of that information, and the people team want to own that information. So we're changing the dynamic of that conversation by doing this. So how do microservices help in this? Well, first, if we can identify these areas that are in the monolith that kind of, you know, don't really belong there, the staffing system can take that. So they've inherited this stuff, you know, so they can have a look, and they're like, leave doesn't make sense. We don't think leave belongs in staffing, and we don't really think rates belong in staffing either. You know, they should move somewhere else. And what we can do is we can refactor that, and we can move leave to people, and we can move rates to sales. Now, where microservices help here is that rather than, you know, you've got now a kind of a wide range of options of how you deliver that, whereas before you've just got a monolith. And so, you know, we can either say staffing system says, well, I'll tell you what, we've got a load of code here. I know it's Ruby on Rails and it's 5 years old, but what we'll do is we'll cut it out, we'll put it in a new repo, and here we go, people team, that's all the leave stuff. It's all yours. Or the people team can say, do you know what, your implementation, it's a really bit sucky and a bit buggy. We'll just build something new and we'll rewrite it from scratch. Or in one case, one of the services that we made, we rewrote it from scratch, and we rewrote it as a JSON file. It was that simple. I think it's the smallest service we had. The service was basically what is the hierarchy of the company, which is where offices relate to countries. We had a whole database in Oracle with the Ruby on Rails front end, a full CRUD app just to say what offices were in what country, a fact that doesn't really change much. So, you know, so we could do that, and we changed that to a JSON file, stuck it on S3, and we said, there you go. Put an API gateway in front of it, job done. The smallest microservice we have, no code. So this is really great. This was fantastic, except the good story kind of, you know, ends there a little bit, because this caused a lot of problems as well. Now, these were kind of problems that, in a centralized system, were really easy to solve. And microservices actually aggravate this. or they introduced new problems. So yes, the world is much better. The world was much, much better. Within our bounded context, everything was going much better. Our business people were much happier. But as soon as we started crossing any lines between those bounded contexts, things got messy. So we got make it up fatigue. This is true. Basically, if anyone wanted to do auth on their APIs, they all decided a different way of doing it. So staffing thought, I'll go for an API, a key pair implementation over a basic, header. People team just went, oh, well, you know what, just send your username and password of a system account over basic auth, because, that's what we've used. And sales team were being a little bit more, let's use OAuth 2, that's the new thing. So we had no kind of strategy there, I'm going to say the word global, though Kelvin obviously said don't see the word global and he gets scared. But we had no strategy at a kind of global level, which meant that basically if you were any of those teams, now you've got an N+1 problem. So rather than having to deal with one authentication scheme to talk to all your microservices inside your sales, you've now got, your own ones, plus everybody else's to deal with. So, which makes your code quite complicated and, is introducing a lot of complexity. And of course, worse is this, it's waste, right? It's like food waste. It's the moral, it's horrible, right? Food waste has that moral thing with it, and so does wasting developers' time. And this was interesting. Kelvin was talking about economies of scale and how we don't get economies of scale in software development. But what we're really, really good at in software development is creating waste. And that's what keeps your CIO up at night. And that's what makes managers, development managers and things come up with really annoying rules, and architects really annoying rules, because they're worrying about this stuff. They're really worrying that, the teams are doing the same thing and they're making loads of waste. So, and what they want to do is reduce waste to make everyone more efficient. And of course, what you see is when we move to this microservices, whoa, look at all this waste. Everyone's repeating and solving the exact same problem over and over again. So logging is a great example. How many elk stacks can your company create? And let's think about that. How long does it create to kind of build an elk stack? Maybe, you've got a dev pair on that. Maybe 3 or 4 weeks. They get their elk stack up and running, 3 or 4 weeks. They've done it really well, though. They've, Phoenix, it's on AWS, it's an immutable server. It's, really good elk stack. And then they've got to maintain it, and then every now and again they've got to upgrade it, and then sometimes there's a bug, and sometimes it falls down. And over about a year or so of this kind of team, which has got 6 dev pairs, you've probably spent a good month and a half, 2 months just on your elk stack, which isn't really where you want to spend your money if you're repeating that across every single development team in your organization. That is food waste, right? It's morally bad. Now, the other problem we ran into is specialisms. So I don't know if anyone went to the talk yesterday morning. I think it's Diego, was it? Diogo's talk about deep learning. Right, within about 5 slides, I was lost. This is seriously hard. And as we're moving through the decades of software development, life is getting much, much more complicated. And we can't all have someone like that in every single team. So we want cross-functional teams. We want them to be responsible for their own success and all the expertise required to do so. But we can't have someone with intimate knowledge of all of those deep learning algorithms inside every single one of our teams. We can't have someone with intimate knowledge of data analytics inside, or statistics inside all of our teams, or infrastructure, or security, etc., etc. iOS development, Android development. It's going on and on and on. They're just adding more and more stuff for us to learn. It's crazy. So how do we do that? How do we cope with this? And actually, infrastructure is a really good point. This was one of the things I observed in our teams. And that was that we kind of put infrastructure. And that's pretty much, you know, who has a development team that is responsible for their own infrastructure here? So a fair few. So this is kind of becoming a bit of a mainstream idea, right? Now we've got Ansible. We just give the infrastructure to the developers. And we've got this idea of cross-functional teams. So the developers are responsible for infrastructure. So this is one of our, you know, it's quite a big microservice. It's quite a heavily active microservice. So it had about 1,000 commits in a year. And this was quite typical. So I looked and I did the stats on this. This is quite typical. Out of those 1,000 commits in a year on that microservice, just four commits were on infrastructure in the Ansible directory, right? If I can make it move, come on, move. So 3 were to add environment variables. So this is real heavy lifting now, right? Adding an environment variable. And the other one was to change the log format. So in 1 year, this is all that changed on that microservice at an infra level. And we're saying we've got to have infrastructure specialism in every team. So what's the result of this when we say this? So this is a true story. This is about 6 months ago. I'm sitting in the Manchester office where the digital team are, and they're responsible for our website. And for about, I'd say maybe 9 days, they've been suffering from an issue to do with SSH key. They couldn't get an SSH key to authenticate because Rackspace had changed the way their SSH key worked for doing the deployment. So they couldn't deploy. Luckily, I'm sitting there and I'm listening, and then I'm thinking, this is a bit weird. So I start talking to them, and there's all this stuff in Go going on, all this low-level stuff in Go going on, and we're trying to debug the Go code, because that's where we're happy, right, developers? We can debug the Go code. And there's a guy on the beach who's an ops guy, and he overhears as well, and he says, let me have a look. And he kind of goes over, and he gets out of Go, and he goes to command terminal, types in a load of open SSL stuff, I don't know what he typed, but he typed it. And he went, right, yeah, it's this RSA key has this thing, they've changed it to this thing, like that. In seconds, his specialist knowledge solved this problem that this team was never going to solve, right? It'd taken them 7-9 days to solve it. So when we kind of moved these specialist responsibilities into the teams, what we lost was that specialist knowledge. Because when you have those horizontal teams, what's really good is you've got an ops guy who spends all of his day, shushing. So he really knows what's going on. Whereas when you go back and you put that in the development teams, they're going to touch it 4 times in a year, and it's not going to be that complicated what they're going to touch. So the problem is solving this, you don't want to fall back on those bad patterns of creating these horizontal teams. We don't want to go back to an ops team that is responsible for all the servers and giving all that control to centralization. But as, yesterday one of the, I can't remember his name, D'Andrea's talk, he was saying, it's much more complicated than decentralized versus centralized when he was talking about the drones and stuff. It's much more complicated than that. There are these lines between, and I think this is a great example. There are these lines between centralizing something and decentralizing something. And we really wanted to avoid these silos, so we looked at different ways of doing it. So the first one, which everyone jumps to, is enforcement, right? This is, okay, I'm your InfoSec guy or I'm your infra guy. You go and write some code, I'll do a code review. So what happens is, the day before you're going to production, you put it in front of the infra guy, and he just wants to go home. He's planned his weekend out. He looks at it and he goes, I'm really sorry, you can't put this into production. It's got this problem with it, this problem with it. And then the developer just goes, look, but I know it's not meeting your standards, and you would have written better code and everything, and if it's the security guy, you're like, I know it opens a great big security hole, but come on, I've got to put this in production tomorrow or everyone's on my back. So what happens with the enforcement role is, in the end, InfoSec or InfoSec, on your heads be it, nothing to do with me, and then you just get ignored and you end up with bad security everywhere, because delivery pressures always win. So you try the consultancy model. So we moved to the consultancy model, and this was much better. This worked much, much better. So this is the model where early on in the life cycle, the team reaches out to one of these specialists and says, you know, we're gonna be putting this into production you know, we're just writing the stories now. We're just writing the stories, and it's going to go into production in 3 months. What should we be considering from a security angle about these stories? So, and then the guy goes, well, this is a web UI, you know, if you've gone through OWASP top 10. Oh, no, I haven't gone through OWASP top 10. Well, looking at your app, I think you need to go through this one, you know, think about cross-site scripting, think about this, and the developers, they nod, yeah, that's really good, I'll go and read on that. And then the day before production, you're going out to production, the InfoSec guy kind of sends a nice friendly message over Slack or whatever and says, how did you get on with that OWASP top 10 thing? And they went, yes, I forgot about that. Delivery pressures. So the consultancy model, you know, has its problems as well. So the partnership model. So this one works even better. We take what works from the consultancy model and we try a partnership model. And that is, your specialist from your team works with the cross-functional team, and they pair with them. Sit on the keyboard, pair with them, walk through it. And this can be really, really successful. It can sometimes fail. Sometimes people pay a little bit of lip service to the person that pairs. It's a bit like, I don't know if anyone's seen that sketch, you know, where someone does the washing up. I'll teach you to do the washing up, and they do the washing up, and they go, I didn't quite get that, show me again. And then they do the washing up, and they go, I didn't get that, show me again, until all the plates are done. So you can have that, and it does happen. But sometimes it is really successful, and the team. But there's 2 key problems with partnership model is, one, you've got resource constraints. You know, if you've got one InfoSec specialist across 10 teams, they all need that person at the same time. That's a really stressed individual. And the second thing is, it tends to be very based on relationships. Like all good partnerships, they're based on relationships. But, you know, we had a case where we had a really good partnership between 2 individuals, and they both moved teams. So great, that was great while that partnership lasted. Now they've moved teams, that's gone. Everything they learned went with them. So what's the solution? So this, if you go back to mid-Victorian era, 19th century, mid-19th century, if you wanted to take a photo, if you wanted to be a photographer, this is what you had to do. And this is so complicated that I can't even pronounce it. And that's how you pronounce it, and I can't even read how you pronounce it. So that's how hard it is. That's how specialist it was. Well, nowadays, who can take a photo? You know, like back then, you really needed a specialist just to take a photo. Now we all walk around, and then I tell you, you know, we're swamped with photos. My 4-year-old takes photos. Everyone takes photos. In fact, I'm almost of the opinion that I don't need to take photos anymore, because someone else would have taken 100 photos of where I am for me. So what we've managed to do over, admittedly, 150 years, is take a process that was incredibly complicated and required specialist knowledge, but turn that into something so simple and commoditize it so that anyone can do it. Now the conversation's changing again, right? We're all expert photographers. I mean, hands up who thinks they're a good photographer in the room, you know. See, there's quite a few of us, and we're techies. I think there are more people who do photography in techie than anywhere else. There's always someone bombarding me with their Flickr. So what does this look like? How do we achieve this? You know, it sounds really simple. We just take an incredibly complicated process like making a camera and turn it into a mobile app. Well, this guy, he got it right. 10 years ago, he got his mandate out, which basically said everyone should create an API. Now, there's something that we all often miss about this story. So, how many people here use AWS in some form or another? Right, okay, now keep your hands up if you use AWS to do bookstore stuff. Oh, nobody. So, but his business is a bookstore, right? But what he solved is this idea that there's this incredibly complex, horizontal, specialized stuff happening in his business, which was running a bookstore, that if he could somehow commoditize and make that really simple and separate that ownership from that control, which was, goes back to that anecdote that was yesterday that Scott told, where that guy went, oh, you're using SSDs, and he said, I don't care, I rent them. You know, when you've got to that point, you've solved this problem. And Bezos got it, right? He understood that. I don't think it was deliberate, we can give him credit for it, but what emerged was the biggest server farm in the world. So what's that look like? Well, it's a return to Conway, basically. So Conway, let's think of the organization we want, and then let's structure our business around that. So I call this the fabric tech. So this isn't a horizontal team again, but it's a horizontal capability. And that fabric tech has all those horrible jobs that your team finds difficult, API management, build, source, security, all of that. And you put it in there and you try and remove it from the teams. Now, that doesn't mean that the teams lose everything. They still have their own capability tech, so there may be things about their kind of vertical that are special to them, but you're trying to remove some of that stuff. And how do you do that? You know, well, you form teams that look like this. They just look like the teams that we had, cross-functional teams with some services, with product owners, with the specialists in, with the vendor management in, with the support in. But the difference is rather than them in the old centralized model being kind of obsessed with having the control and the ownership, is they're kind of giving up that control part and they're just responsible for the ownership part. So you know, this is an actual example of we did a kind of look at our services and what we needed. This is quite high level. And we looked at what ones we had and who owns them. So this is our kind of fabric. So you've got things in there like logging, monitoring, synthetic monitoring, user analytics, APIs, auth-Z, auth-N. And the idea is now, rather than kind of having a centralized version of this, which is, you know, you do partnership or whatever with, it's like, well, these teams provide the services to enable you to the capability teams to accomplish these things without having deep specialist knowledge of them. A really, really good example, which was in Sam's talk, was Let's Encrypt. I think that's a great example of the sort of thing a cross-functional team one of these teams can solve for you. Now, generally, this doesn't mean that you build everything yourself. It might be that you use AWS if you're an infrastructure team, but that team will be responsible for the vendor management of that stuff. It'll be responsible for ensuring that you get up and running, and it, you know, hopefully it's put some APIs in front so you can, you know, you just call an API and say, create me an AWS account, and it's set up all the billing and all the integration with your authorization systems and all of that for you. You know, that's all done. You're not worrying about all of that stuff as a cross-functional team. Same with things like SSL. You want SSL. You don't want to, you know, I'm remembering the times when I put a calendar notice to say that my SSL certificate was going to run out, and then I'd forget how the hell I did this convoluted process. Oh my God, I hope I can't go on holiday. The SSL certificate, and I'm the only one in the team. You know, now we don't have that. We've got Let's Encrypt, and so that's for this team, this fabric team, to kind of go, we want to solve this problem. We either look to the market to solve it, or we build something ourselves. So this isn't going to happen like overnight, right? Some of these problems are really easy, and some of these problems are really hard. So there is a maturity here. So this is kind of like Wardley. I don't know if anyone's seen the Wardley diagram. They talk about mapping this, but they talk about these 4 stages: genesis, custom build, product, and kind of commodity or platform. So inside an organization, I think this works like this. Genesis, it's patterns generally. A custom build is, something solution specific that you've built inside your team. Whereas the product, you've probably extracted a library or a framework, and for the platform, it will be a real service. So, as my example, you could say patterns, continuous integration. Some point was a pattern. If you read some of Martin Fowler's stuff, he'll talk about the teams within that he worked on that started talking about this. And then, someone solution-specific, they came up with the idea of the pattern. This sounds like a good idea. So they built a build server very specifically to test out their theory on 1 or 2 or 3 projects. And after a while, they did cruise control, which was the first CI server. And then, that's great. You've got a product, and everyone downloads it and maintains it and looks after it themselves. But eventually, you get to this. You get a Snap. I have to say, Snap is the Thoughtworks version of Jenkins CI. So Jenkins CI, where it's a hosted solution, and you're not doing any, you're not looking after anything. It just works. You've got the AWS version. And so what that tends to look like is the stuff that's in your Genesis and your custom build stuff is going to be your capability tech, where your vertical teams are actually probably doing something quite experimental. They're in a Genesis stage, they're learning about it. Let's say they're thinking about event sourcing or something like that, or microservices for that matter, or Phoenix servers or whatever. They're playing with some patterns and they're implementing them. But then as you move across, what you want to do is you want to start picking that stuff up from your teams, and you want to start moving it from the product to platform lifecycle. So hopefully you can skip product, because that would be great, and just move to services, but that doesn't always happen, because sometimes it's a bit more complicated than that. But you want that kind of handover, where you say, let's get this out of the capability teams, let's move it to the fabric team, and let's make this part of our fabric. Now, some companies have different ways of looking at this, and this is this balance between autonomy and standardization. So a while ago, Etsy caused a big storm in the software world with a talk called Why It's Important to Have Boring Software or something like that. I don't know if anyone read that. It was a blog post. Whereas Etsy say, you know what, you've got a stack. This is the language. This is the stack. This is what you're going to use. That's it. Whereas on the other side, people are more flexible. So in Thoughtworks, we're much more flexible. The fact we're distributed is a reason for that. If everyone was in the same room and they weren't thought workers, because they have a lot of opinions, thought workers, if everyone was in the same room and they weren't thought workers, I might be able to, as head of technology, impose a tech stack on everyone. But actually, we want that flexibility. So there's not a right or wrong way. Do you want stability? Do you want innovation? How you balance that up? Where are you on your maturity curve? And then, with great power, these autonomous teams does become the responsibility. They have to contribute back to the fabric. So, to kind of finish off, remove the yak from the teams. To do that, you need to preserve the autonomy by preserving control, so they're responsible for their own success. But you need to provide specialism via, microservices to keep all the expertise necessary. And that's it. So thank you. Please, as it says, remember to rate the session.
And there's one question. Thinking on machine learning or even UX design, how can we commoditize domain expert knowledge? What's the fabric tech equivalent for machine learning or UX, where there isn't a clear product version of that expertise?
So I think machine learning is a really interesting one, and hopefully someone else will solve it for us. It's basically where my bet is going. So for example, it looks like Google and Amazon and everyone are getting in on this already. So they're coming up with some good machine learning stuff. Obviously, if you can't do that, it becomes a constraint on your business because you do have that problem where you can't put the specialists everywhere. So UX is different because UX is, I think, is probably one of those cross-functional roles that does need to be in every team because it is integral, right? Like building code is for developers, UX is for creating usable systems. So I think UX is a specialism that does belong in a cross-functional team to a degree. That's my cop-out there.
Are there any other questions? Someone? Okay, that's it. Thank you, Peter.
Cheers, thank you.